This was always the plan. I said from the beginning that if I ever reached episode 10, then this is what I would do. So here I am, about to embark on probably my most significant journey yet. And this one is one I have to do alone. In all my episodes, I've featured usually just one person. However, I felt that episode 10 had to be significant. There is a place that I believe every serious Titanic enthusiast should visit at least once in their lifetime if they have the opportunity to. A pilgrimage of sorts. My journey today begins at a hotel at London's Heathrow Airport, so I better get some sleep because in the morning I take to the skies.
The next station is Heathrow Terminals 2 and 3. Please remember to keep all your personal belongings with you at all times.
She was the largest ship of her time. A technological marvel. Sending shockwaves around the globe, her maiden voyage would be her last. Just 4 days into her first crossing, RMS Titanic sank in the North Atlantic, taking 1,500 lives with her. These are the stories of those who witnessed firsthand one of the greatest maritime disasters in peacetime history.
The water is freezing and there aren't enough boats. Half the people on this ship are going to die.
Scientists of a joint U.S.-French expedition said today they have found wreckage of the ocean liner whose name is a legend, the SS Titanic.
Hello and welcome. Welcome to episode 10 of my Beyond the Titanic series, and I've come to quite a special place today with a significant link to the Titanic disaster. I'm here in Halifax, Nova Scotia in Canada, and in today's episode I plan to take you around this city and discover the Titanic related sites. But before we get into it, let's take a step back in time and take a look at why I've come here today. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Beyond the Titanic episode 10. This episode is going to be a dedication to all those who Titanic left behind and how they made their final journey. Just a quick note, today's episode will include discussion of death and child death and will include images of actual Titanic deceased victims. So just a quick heads up on that one. So with that being said, let's begin. On April 15th, 1912, when Titanic disappeared beneath the surface, she sent over 1,500 people into the icy waters of the Atlantic. The following morning, the Carpathia arrived at Titanic's wreck site and immediately commenced a rescue operation that saw the recovery of over 700 survivors scattered about in Titanic's all-fuel lifeboats. Once all survivors were taken on board, the Carpathia departed and travelled onward to New York. But in doing so, she left behind a tragic scene. The Carpathia steamed away, leaving Titanic's dead behind, strewn across the ocean's surface. Once the massive loss of life had become evident to White Star, they realised that it would need to be addressed as quickly and efficiently as possible. The frozen corpses had to be recovered. White Star scoured the coastline for a port that was both close to the location of Titanic's last known position and also well equipped to undertake the recovery. The port of Halifax, Nova Scotia was chosen because of its direct rail link and steamship capabilities. In total, White Star chartered 4 ships to return to the wreck site: the Mackay Bennett, the Minia, the Montmagny and the Algerine. Not sure on the pronunciation on some of them, but let's just go with it. Each vessel was stocked with embalming supplies, undertakers, clergy, canvas body bags and coffins. On Wednesday, April 17th, even before the Carpathia had docked in New York with the survivors, the Mackay Bennett left Halifax bound for the wreck site. En route, she received messages from the German liner Rhine and Bremen, both reporting to have spotted large amounts of debris and hundreds of floating bodies within the vicinity of the disaster site. Bruce Ismay, chairman of the White Star Line and Titanic survivor, released a statement which included the following. The cable ship Mackay Bennett has been chartered by the White Star Line and ordered to proceed to the scene of the disaster and do all she could to recover bodies and glean all information possible. Every effort will be made to identify bodies recovered and any news will be sent through immediately by wireless. The cable ship has orders to remain on the scene for at least a week, but should a large number of bodies be recovered before that time, she will return to Halifax with them. The search for bodies will not be abandoned until not a vestige of hope remains for any more recoveries. On April 21st, the Mackay Bennett arrived at the reported wreck site and immediately set about the grim task of recovering the frozen corpses from the sea. They recovered 51 that day alone, 26 on April 22nd, 128 on the 23rd, 87 on the 25th, and 14 more on the 26th. Some bodies were found some 170 miles from the wreck site. Sadly though, even in death, it's apparent that Titanic's passengers could not escape the social class system of the time. As a general rule, all identified bodies of first class were embalmed, placed in a wooden coffin, and brought back to shore regardless of the condition. On the other hand, bodies of passengers from second and third class and those of crew members were recovered embalmed based on the state of the body. Bodies of said classes that were mangled, deteriorated, or unidentifiable were sealed in weighed canvas bags, given a short funeral service, and sent back overboard, committed to the deep. Of the 306 bodies recovered by the Mackay Bennett, 116 were buried at sea. She returned to Halifax with 190 bodies. On April 30th, 1912, the Mackay Bennett arrived back here after its grim recovery mission at Titanic's wreck site, and it docked just over there. The once busy port had now fallen silent. Those who did line the dockside here could see the coffins piled high upon her deck. A large tarpaulin covered her lower decks where the bodies were stored that they had run out of coffins for. Hearses lined the streets, ready to take the bodies away one by one, but there was one major problem. How was this city going to manage such a large influx of the dead? Once the recovery operation had been completed by all ships involved, a total of 337 bodies had been recovered from the sea. Of that, 119 of those were returned to the deep and 209 were brought back here to Halifax. At this point, you may be thinking, well, James, your math isn't mathing quite well there. 337 minus 119 does not equal 209. Well, the figure of 337 is inclusive of all bodies found. Passing ships also spotted and recovered bodies sometime after the sinking. For example, the Oceanic stumbled across collapsible lifeboat A on May the 13th and found the badly decomposed remains of 3 bodies. These were all buried at sea. At 9:30 am, the Mackay Bennett docked a little further up from her normal berth, instead docking at a location near the naval dockyard north of the coaling wharf. The area was larger and a concrete wall helped to maintain a certain level of privacy. First to be brought ashore were of course the coffins of first class, followed by second and third, who were sewn into canvas bags. It took around 3.5 hours for all the bodies to be unloaded. We're now going to talk about Jon Snow. No, not the Jon Snow you're thinking about, because I'd never heard of Jon Snow until I started filming this episode, because I belong to a very small percentage of the world's population who have never seen a single episode of Game of Thrones. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, well, chances are you haven't either. After the sinking of Titanic, White Star contacted Jon Snow Funeral Directors, one of the largest funeral companies here in Halifax, and they provided the recovery team with all the coffins, ice, embalmers and everything they needed to complete their grim task. And they were based just in this building just behind me here. Today it has been converted into the Five Fishermen's Restaurant, and if you believe such things, is subject to the odd ghost story or two. Personally, I prefer the company of the dead over the living any day, because the dead are less likely to break into your home in the middle of the night and rob you. And I'm entirely unsure about how I feel about the whole afterlife thing. Once is quite enough. I don't plan on coming back. And if I do, I ain't going to a restaurant surrounding myself by all that food that I can't eat. No wonder they're cranky. The restaurant today, as its name suggests, primarily specialises in fish and lobster, and I hate seafood. Something about my dinner staring back at me that just doesn't quite sit right with me. However, I did pop my head in just to have a bit of a nosy about. Now, although Jon Snow's funeral home was responsible for dealing with Titanic's dead, the building was nowhere near big enough to deal with such an influx of all the bodies at once, and so a temporary location was needed. However, this building did accommodate the bodies of some of Titanic's richest, including that of John Jacob Astor. I've come to the former Mayflower curling rink location, and it is here that a temporary morgue was set up for the Titanic victims. The bodies that have been recovered were laid out on the ice here for people to identify. It's reported that people from all over the United States and even the world came to this location unsure of what they might find. They walked up and down the rows of bruised and battered bodies, hoping, or maybe not hoping, to find their loved one. For some, it was a sense of closure had they been found. For others, it was the grim confirmation that their loved one was not coming home. Of all the bodies laid out here, however, sadly, there was one particular body that many just couldn't even bear to look at. As the first hearse arrived at the rink, large crowds had already begun to gather. The first casket arrived and was carried in, followed by a second and a third, and so on. If the body was already embalmed, it was placed directly onto the ice. If not, it was taken to the embalming area where it was made ready for viewing. Amongst the rows of the deceased was that of a young child. On April 21st, 1912, the crew of the Mackay Bennett found the body of a fair-haired boy estimated to be around 2 years of age. There were no identifying marks on the boy, and it was assumed he belonged to third class. Normally, bodies of third would have been buried at sea. However, the crew were so shocked and saddened by the discovery that they decided to bring the child back to shore in the hope they could reunite a family member with the lost child. On that day, the crew vowed that if the boy went unclaimed, they would all come together and pay for his funeral. Like many other Titanic victims, the boy laid here day after day, hoping someone would claim him, but as the days passed, no one came forward, and he simply became known as the unknown child. As you can probably tell, the Mayflower curling rink no longer exists, as it was destroyed in the Halifax explosion of 1917, and now an army shop stands on the location of which it once stood. Hundreds of people probably walk past this location every single day, totally unaware of its Titanic connection. And if you'd have been here in 1912, you would have witnessed rows and rows of bodies laid out right here on this very spot. It's quite chilling. The rink was rebuilt after the Halifax explosion of 1917, of which you can read more up on at your leisure if you so desire. I don't really have time to get into it right now, but it really is quite a fascinating story. Anyway, the rink remained here until 1962, when it relocated elsewhere and still operates as the Mayflower Curling Club to this day. Snow's funeral home made arrangements with the shipping and railroad companies for transportation of any body that had been claimed by relatives. However, the problem was this service wasn't free. The bodies of first class, like that of John Jacob Astor, the richest man to sail, whose body was recovered, was transported by train quite quickly because the family could afford to do so. White Star bared the cost of retrieving the bodies, but that's about as far as they went. If you wanted to bring your loved one home, chances are, well, you had to pay for it, and this is where many relatives struggled. Many bodies that were identified were simply left with the funeral home because they couldn't afford it. As bodies were claimed, funerals of the victims began to take place both here in Halifax and around the world after victims were shipped back to their families. I've come to St George's Anglican Church here in Halifax, and it's here where many of the funerals, as well as other locations around the city, began to take place. However, as the days passed, one particular body went unclaimed, that of the unknown child. And so the crew of the Mackay Bennett stepped in and made good on their promise to ensure the little boy was not forgotten. The funeral of the unknown child took place on May 4th, 1912 and was paid for by the recovery crew and funds received from the Astor family as a thank you for recovering John Jacob Astor's body. The boy's tiny white coffin was carried up the steps there and into the church. Now the crew also had a special copper plate made which read "Our Babe" and rested it across the chest of the child within the coffin. However, unknown to them at the time, this kind gesture would play a significant role in the child's story nearly 100 years later. The church has quite a solid link to the Titanic. The captain of the Minia, one of the recovery vessels, asked his rector from this church to accompany them on their mission to conduct religious services on board. As a thank you, Father Henry Ward Cunningham was given a deck chair from Titanic, which had been recovered from the debris field. More on that in just a bit. Now, me being quite naturally inclined to curiosity, I peeked inside the church, and honestly I was quite surprised I didn't burst into flames, all things considered. I spoke with one of the clergy who showed me where the coffin would have been placed at the altar, and he even allowed me to take several pictures and videos. It's probably the first time I've been met with gracious welcome when filming one of these episodes, and for that I'm ever so grateful, so thank you to the people of St George's. Including St George's, there were other churches that held memorial services to the victims of Titanic, including St Paul's Anglican Church, St Mary's Cathedral Basilica, Brunswick Street United Church and Cathedral Church of All Saints. Next up, I've come to the Maritime Museum of the Atlantic on the waterfront. It's the oldest and largest maritime museum in Canada, with a collection of over 300,000 artefacts. It was opened in 1948 and holds items as big as a sailing boat down to a rolling pin. Now, because of the city's connection to the Titanic, it therefore comes as no surprise that the museum has a permanent section on Titanic with some of the ship's most famous of items. This item here is a deck chair from Titanic, the same one I mentioned not long ago, the one which was given to Father Cunningham. He donated it to the museum, and today it can be seen here on display. Now, if you watched James Cameron's Titanic, which chances are you have, you'll know all about this piece, how Rose survives by floating on a door. However, it wasn't a door at all. It was based on this piece just here. This is a section of wood from the first class lounge that broke free during the sinking, and the prop used in the movie is based on this single piece of wood. Today it remains one of the largest pieces recovered from inside the Titanic, and the debate rages on as to whether Jack could have fit on that door. If you come to the museum, you can take a look at the piece for yourself and form your own opinion. The jury's out for me on that one. The museum really is worth a visit if you're ever in Halifax, not just for its Titanic section. Personally, I found their collection of model ships incredible and had to quash the desire to try and run out the front door with one. Believe me, if I had the baggage allowance, I might have tried. You can easily spend a whole day here, and I did. Mainly because, well, I had to. It was pouring with rain and blowing a gale, so it was either stay in the Museum of the Atlantic or go for a swim in it, because no doubt I would have been blown off the waterfront had I ventured outside. All joking aside though, it really is worth a visit. Coming back to a more sombre note now here, because one of the most poignant items on display here are these. This tiny pair of shoes is about to tug on your heartstrings. These were found on the body of the unknown child and were given to the museum as a permanent reminder of the human loss from Titanic. It really is quite moving to be standing here in the presence of all these items. It makes one feel the sorrow people must have experienced. Imagine these shoes being the shoes of your child, your brother, your cousin, whoever. It really does make you sit back and reflect. In total, 59 bodies of those identified were claimed by family members and taken elsewhere for burial. This left 150 remaining in Halifax, many of which went unidentified. I'm on my way to discover what became of them. And this is quite significant for me because this is the first time I'm seeing it for myself. White Star paid for those who were unidentified and those who could not be transported home to their families to be buried in Halifax, and the majority were brought here. This is the Fairview Cemetery in Halifax, Nova Scotia, and the Titanic victims were buried here in this mass grave. Although they were all buried together, each body has its own individual headstone. However, families of those who were identified but could not be transported home were given the option of a larger, more elaborate headstone with a name, but of course if you chose this option, it came at a price. There are many well-known Titanic victims buried here, including John Hume here. He was a member of Titanic's famous band and played along with Wallace Hartley as the ship sank. Now, I've covered Hartley in a previous episode, so check it out if you've got the time. Including Mr. Hume here, only the bodies of 3 of Titanic's band were ever recovered, the other being that of John Clark. He is also buried in Halifax, but because of his Catholic faith is buried at the Mount Olivet Cemetery, a short distance from here. Now, another grave here that has become more significant, if for want of a better word than any other, is this grave. This is the grave of J. Dawson, and before 1997 this grave was like any other in this cemetery. However, thanks to James Cameron's blockbuster Titanic, people believe that this is the real grave of Jack Dawson. Now, I don't want to burst any bubbles here, but the character of Jack Dawson is completely fictional. This is actually the grave of Joseph Dawson, a coal trimmer on the Titanic. Now, before the movie came out, James Cameron stated that he never knew of J. Dawson, and it's pure coincidence that this happened to be his grave. Nevertheless, fans of the movie still flock here year in, year out, believing this to be the grave of Jack Dawson. It's not. Sorry. Now, as you walk along the rows of headstones here, you cannot help but notice that many contain just a number, and that's because the body that went into that grave was never identified, and the number on the headstone corresponds with the order in which it was recovered from the sea. And it's likely that those graves will forever remain just that, just a number. However, not every victim buried here was destined to remain unknown. There is one particular grave I'm keen to see here, and it's just up here. On May the 4th, 1912, the tiny white coffin of the unknown child was brought here and buried right here. This headstone was paid for and erected by the crew of the recovery vessel and reads the following. Erected to the memory of an unknown child whose remains were recovered after the disaster to the Titanic, April 15th, 1912. Although the bodies of 2 other children were recovered from the sea, it's this body that came to symbolise all the child loss from the Titanic, some of which were never recovered, and this grave is a way of remembering them all. Now, nearly 100 years, the body of the unknown child rested here. However, in 2002, modern technology was about to shed new light on its identity. A team of researchers for a television documentary opened 3 of the graves in an attempt to identify those inside, including that of the unknown child. Sadly, 2 of the graves were flooded, and all remains had decomposed beyond the state of retrieving any usable DNA. When the grave of the unknown child was opened, all that could be retrieved were that of a few teeth and a tiny fragment of bone from the arm of the child. In an eerie twist of fate, it is thought that the tiny bone fragment had been preserved due to the copper memorial plate that had been placed across the child from the crew of the recovery vessel. The copper from the plate had fused with the bone and preserved it. So not only had the actions of the crew immortalised the child's memory, it had potentially assisted in the attempts to give him a name nearly 100 years later. The bone fragment and teeth were sent for testing, and DNA was successfully retrieved. The Titanic and scientific world celebrated, as initially the child was identified to be that of Eno Panula, a 13-month-old Finnish boy. However, in 2007, after further testing by Canadian researchers at Lakehead University, this was established to be incorrect, after a type of mitochondria DNA did not match that of the Panula family. So further DNA testing finally revealed the identity of the unknown child to be that of Sidney Leslie Goodwin. Now, Sidney here was travelling with his entire family, comprising of his mum, his dad and 5 older siblings, the entire family were travelling in 3rd class. Although not much is known about the actions of the Goodwin family on the night, what we do know is by the time they reached the boat deck, all of the lifeboats were gone. The entire Goodwin family were lost in the sinking, and Sydney here was the only body of the family to be recovered. My time here in Halifax is coming to an end, and this trip has left me with mixed feelings. I've been a lifelong Titanic buff, as many of you will know, as far back as I can remember, and I've come a long way from the geeky little 10-year-old sitting in his bedroom reading books and watching documentaries. I still remember the very first time I read about the final resting place of many of Titanic's dead, and vowed that one day I would visit. I kind of feel like my Titanic story has reached its apex. Apart from visiting the wreck, I can't see how I can get any closer to Titanic. So is this my final Titanic journey? Who knows? I mean, probably not. I only said that to add a bit of tension and dramatic effect. I've actually got a lot more planned. So that is it for today's episode. I'm going to wrap things up here, and I don't really quite know what to say. This place has been on my list of places to visit since way back, as far back as I can remember, and this is the first time I've actually come here, and yeah, there are no words really to describe how I'm feeling. Thank you as always for watching. I hope you've enjoyed today's episode, and don't forget you can subscribe to my YouTube channel for future content, and also follow my own personal Instagram account where you can see what I get up to during filming these episodes. So thank you for the comments, likes and shares. As always, it really means a lot to me that you guys, enjoy what I do. I enjoy doing it, and I'm glad that you enjoy watching me do it. But yeah, kind of lost for words on this one. Keep an eye out for more videos coming soon to my channel, and don't forget to check out my previous episodes from my Beyond the Titanic series. So, from a sombre Halifax, Nova Scotia here in Canada, thank you for watching. Take care, God bless, and I'll see you soon.